Right, so what I'm trying to do is to talk about economics as a textbook science. Textbook science, it's a concept by Thomas Kuhn. We heard of him a lot. But I'm not really just interested in that concept, but the question of, about its function within society, and especially within the neoliberal propaganda project. Here we have, by the way, the only critical quotation I use. After that, I'll just turn to people who have been in favor in using economics and science in general for influencing public opinion. So we here have John Kenneth Galbraith, and he was always complaining in 1973 about the influence economics has on society as a whole. He talks about that the instruction of economics implants an imprecise but still serviceable set of ideas in the minds of many. He talks about economic science leading to accept what you might as a citizen otherwise criticize. And he talks about economic science not even coming close to reality, but doing something very different to implant what he calls a surrogate for the reality. And he's always talking in 1973 about a broad influence economics has, not only on professors, but also on journalists, commentators, legislators, and so on. And I guess this has been a question that kind of ran through this whole conference we had here for the last 2 days. We had the question of why is economic teaching as unrealistic, monistic, and unreflective as it is today? And often you hear from mainstream economics, it's because it's a kind of truth, or it's an outcome of a scientific progress, or it's a kind of Darwinian argument, a kind of survival of the fittest theory. Others have told us it's by chance or it's by fate. And I just want to remember that Bofinger yesterday said, well, for him, the persistence of mainstream economic teaching, it's kind of a puzzle. And I think we have to find a question why, even after severe economic crisis that mainstream economic teaching could not give any answer to, why is it still persisting today? And my thesis is that I want to argue with you today is that is no internal reason. It's not due to anything within the economic science itself, but it has to do with the wider influence of economic thinking. What I'm trying to show by going through a history of ideas, it's nothing much more that I can do here, is that economic education, as it is today, the certain features it has, can play a massive role in influencing public opinion, and as such has come part and parcel of what we could call a neoliberal project of influencing public opinion. So what I'm going to do is to show you a history of ideas, asking the question, how can science in general, and especially economic science as we know today, come to play a part in the influence of public opinion, or to put it more bluntly, within the neoliberal propaganda project. I'm just giving you a history of ideas, talking about the role of economics. I'm not talking of the power structures, just because of time, you could also show this, and I'm not talking about networks, trying to make this project possible. So I think first it's important to tell you shortly what I mean about economic education. I think it's really, if you talk about the influence economics has on society as a whole, it is to really talk about the process of education. It's not just about methodology, it's not the content, it's not the what of economics, it's the how. How is it done? For reasons I will explain later. It's really to put a focus on education, or as training, as you said, in a sense of Ausbildung in the German context. And here we have it from Paul Samuelson, but you could also find it from other authors, especially Greg Menke, that it is really much of the most prominent textbook authors really talk about the project of influencing minds. Some critical German newspapers have talked about brainwashing, and it's not really used by economists themselves, or not very often, but this project of influencing minds is a dominant theme, at least in the American context. It's not really what I'm talking about. It's not just about Volkswirtschaftslehre. It's not about those, I get it's about 7,000 students that still study VWL in Germany, but it's what Greg Menke called, it's about those 1 or 2 introductory semesters. These are used, or that's my thesis, it's used for influencing the minds of students as future citizens, as Paul Samuelson said. And this is indeed a huge project, which I think is not really mentioned too much in this conference. In the United States, you have to cover those 1 or 2 semesters just about everyone at college level. It's not just a project of universities, but everyone has to go through it. That's far over 1 million students each year. And in Germany, because of the Bologna process, what has happened is that economics on an introductory level has been implanted into many other sciences. It's not just Betriebswirtschaftslehre, it's also medicine, engineering, and so on. And these courses, for the most people, are the only contact they have with the economic science. And in those classes, textbooks, which will play a dominant role in what I'm trying to tell, are used. And of course, we have, as Till van Treek pointed out quite a lot, and people like Bettina Zurstrassen, that this is also implanted compulsory and school level. Here, Germany is lagging far behind. In the United States, we have something called K-12 standards of economic education, and K is short for kindergarten, and so it runs up a compulsory economic education from kindergarten up to the highest classes at school. So my first part, I'll talk about what really is a textbook science according to Thomas Kuhn. It's a concept about the 1960s, about the 60s in the last century. And so it's something that people knew about, especially in Chicago and elsewhere, when the real mainstreaming of economic education took place. So it's also to know about the history, what has been known by people trying to influence or to model economic education like science education. Some people say that the concept of a paradigm has been quite controversial in Kuhn, but you really look at it, it's a quite fixed concept with a very specific content. For Kuhn, first of all, education is the initiation into a scientific community. So it's all about, not about just forming individual minds, but shaping a mindset which is social, and in which every individual is sort of introduced and is made to shape its own mind, to model its own mind, his or her own mind, after the whole community of practitioners. So if you want to have a sort of common mindset within a science, you have to have similar education and professional initiations. So if you talk about a heterodox economics, it's just running against this, because what you have is you have to have a uniform training in the whole of the world, in every specific college or laboratory or wherever. You have to have similar education procedures. And within those procedures, you gain tacit knowledge. It's about those implicit assumptions, what Skidelsi called Weltanschauung, but it's also a special way, not just of knowing, but of doing. For example, I've been trained as a chemical engineer here in Berlin, and tacit knowledge is how to handle the tools, like shaking, for example, specific things so they don't explode, for example. And you just learn how to do it by copying people. And Kuhn's concept of paradigm is that it's not just about using tools, but also using intellectual tools. So you're trained, for example, in using certain concepts like energy or force, and you don't know what it means, but you can just use it as it was called in a puzzle-solving context. So you have given pieces, like concepts, and you know how to arrange them in a certain way, but you can never say what energy is or what force is. So if you use this concept in an economic context, it would, for example, mean that you can tell a similarity of different markets, the similarity between a market of employment, a market of bananas or cars or whatever. It's always like this, but you cannot explain what this means. Yeah? So you can tell a similarity, but you cannot tell the puzzle pieces themselves. So in this way, it's an endless repetition, because you're not acquiring self-reflective knowledge, but just by applying the same procedures, for example, mathematical procedures, you get a knowledge, but you cannot tell the rules of it. And in this way, there's a common possession, he says, of the practitioners of a particular discipline, and this is all under the level of conscious awareness. As Kuhn said, it's a mental set by which you come to think as a scientist, but you can never think about itself. And it consists of symbolic generalizations, for example, as I said, force, but you could also say in the economic context, or this is what we would have to test. For example, if you have the concept of utility, you can use it, but you don't know what it is. It's a shared commitment to beliefs. For example, in the economic context, this could be the harmony of the markets, implicitly shared values. We have been talked about this a lot in the conference, and you just know examples, like concrete problem solutions, but you're not able to cover the basic meaning of the used concepts. This brings me to the concept of textbook science. It's a very clear meaning given by Kuhn. It's that textbooks always proceed in a very similar way. They first truncate the scientist's sense of the discipline's history, and then proceed to supply a substitute for what they have eliminated. Because when you look back into the history of ideas, there's always been quarrels really about the concepts themselves. If you use the concept of utility prior to the 19th century, it would have been there, or it would have a very different meaning. So you have, if you really want to train a paradigm, you have to get rid of history and then retell a very different story. You can really see this very nicely in Samuelson or Menkye, that this is precisely what happens in economic science, that there is a story told, that the concepts used today have been used by Adam Smith and so on, and all these heterodox economics you not even talk about. So it's a distortion and selection of scientific history. It's to make the development of science appear linear, or you don't even talk about a development as such, as you see, for example, in Menkye. And then there's a really nice one. It's to invent puzzles that have never existed before. So really try to get a very new kind of problem-solving capability about questions that have never interested someone before the science, in this case, existed. And so it's really not just changing the theory, but also the facts, or the presentation of facts. So what is scientific education? And it's not just, as I said, it's not just science, but it's just the teaching of science going on for a couple of years, or as Menkyu said, at least for a year, and it's to shape mental sets and a tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is a concept, as I said, about knowledge that you use, but you cannot make explicit, and also shaping values and so on. And this is the last point. This is quite important, for that was followed. That we've talked about this, the concept that you have to have a mindset which is prior to the facts you see. So if you do training as a normal scientific education, you come to have a firm picture of the world prior to seeing any facts. So this is a question we had before in quite some of presentation. So what's about scientific revolutions? It's quite interesting that Kuhn at some stages is quite critical of normal scientific education, but he says it's a very good aspect of it, that you are trained to do something very concrete, and so that reality can really bump against this specific scientific procedure, and you can really tell, did you just not do a good scientific job, or is it really reality that doesn't fit the picture any longer? And he says scientific revolutions come about if science is tested against reality, and reality again and again tells us that the picture we have made of it doesn't fit. And then it comes to a scientific revolution. So this is a quite interesting finding for economics as a science, because what happens, as so many of you said before, it doesn't fit reality. It always bumps against reality. It can't explain any crisis, for example, but it's still in place. And from a Kuhnian perspective, from an inner scientific perspective, you cannot explain this resistance. So that's what I'm trying to do now as a next point, is to see what explanation can we give to a kind of education, economic education, that apparently, as Philip Mirowski has just shown again and again, it doesn't change in the fact that it can't explain reality. And this is now that I turn to a very different idea and say, where do we find anything about the role normal scientific education can play for the whole of society? And here I'm just taking part of it and talking about the role of education in science and public relation. Public relation has been a concept shaped by Edward Bernays, and it is just a renaming from the original term propaganda. So up to the 1930s, Edward Bernays used propaganda. Then it wasn't really favorable anymore after what came to happen to his concept in Nazi Deutschland, and so he changed it into public relation, but it's the same concept, it's just a renaming. So we're here in the context of the question which has dominated the history of ideas in the 20th century about the manipulation of a whole of the masses, of the minds of the masses of people. Here it's one of the most important texts we have about this question. It's from 1928, and here Edward Bernays talks about the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. And he holds that is still true today, at least in part, as an important element in democratic society, at least in the United States. He talks about an unseen mechanism constituting an invisible government, which is the two ruling powers of countries. And here it's like what has been found out here, or even invented, is the idea of the unconsciousness of people, which can be molded by others. This is an elite. And interestingly enough, this concept here by Edward Bernays, he was one of the most important figures in marketing, but also in politics in the United States. Is one of those invisible men who's hardly talked about, but he has been one of the most influential people in the United States in the early 20th century. It's about telling, it's about an art of a minority. He's talking about an elite and influencing majorities. To mold the mind, influencing minds, is the same phrases that are used here. And he talks about the need to do this in politics, finance, manufacture, agriculture, charity, education, and other fields of the society. So here it's clear right from the start that propaganda has come to play a massive role even in education. Here's a part of what education can do according to Edward Bernays. And he says, well, usually we use science or here basic universal literacy as an idea that the common man is educated and can make up his or her own mind. But he says, well, that is just an illusion. But instead what happens in normal education is that we create like rubber stamps, he says, with our ink, with advertising slogans, editorials, and published scientific data. And these are what is imprinted on the minds of people and then are duplicated of millions of others. Yeah, so for him, education comes part of molding the mind of millions of people, so they do not think for themselves, but always use a certain kind of mindset before approaching the reality. Edward Bernays, you say, may be well off the economics as a science, but if you turn to someone else, who's Walter Lippmann, you can see it comes very close to the neoliberal project. Walter Lippmann has been a journalist, trained as a journalist, and he is the founder of what is called the Walter Lippmann Kolleg, where Friedrich Hayek, for example, was part of, and this ran up into the formation of the Mont Pelerin Society, which is one of the biggest neoliberal projects itself. So Walter Lippmann has been very influential on Hayek and has been very influential on the Austrian School of Economics and as Chicago as a whole. And we see that he plays a dominant influence on creating and establishing the neoliberal think tanks around the world. I'm talking later about the Institute of Economic Affairs he has established. So turning back to Walter Lippmann, what he says, he first says what Edward Bernays also said, that we are captives of pictures in our head. So there are always filters in our head by which we are made to see the environment or the reality in a specific way. And he talks about how to influence the mind of people is to insert between man and his environment what he calls a pseudo-environment. He uses the word stereotypes on other occasions. That pseudo-environment is behavior is a response. So the whole focus of intention is just on a pseudo-environment of a picture of society. And you act because of that picture, but the action really takes place in reality. But people who are trained in this way are not able to see reality as such anymore, but just are caught by these kind of stereotypes. You can see it like in this way. What you have is a pseudo environment, and the whole perception and decision-making processes are banned onto that picture, and the whole process of this, what you see here on the left, it's an unconscious reaction. So you call about the pseudo environment. It is unconscious. You don't know about it, and your perception and decision is pre-conscious. You could become aware of it, but you usually are not. And the trick is that if you manage to influence what the pseudo environment is, that you can influence the action of people, and the action of people is not taking place in some fantasy land, but it's taking place in the real world or in the real economy. And if you really do this nicely and good, as like a good propaganda project, the consequences of actions cannot be evaluated, because, or they can be evaluated, but just in the terms of the pseudo-environment. You have two different sorts of pseudo-environments, Walter Lippmann said. It says one is formed by culture, by a process of social processes and culture, and then you have what he calls public opinion, spelled with capital letters, and this is what really comes as being manufactured consent. It's really about manufacturing this pseudo-environment. So what has science to do with it? He said, well, we can use science. I'll make this a long story short at this point. You can make use of science in creating pseudo-environments. And this is one of the most important things it should do. So there's a need for interposing some form of expertness between the private citizen and the vast environment in which he's entangled, and you especially have to do this with the politicians. Usually, he says, politicians are really involved in everyday activity. They know as experts the reality they talk about, and what he's trying to do is to put some expertness in between so that the politicians cannot see the actual environment, but are made to make the decision based on what he calls a pseudo-environment. And here it's quite interesting that he says, well, the social sciences, it's 1926, have not been successful until that day to do this, because they haven't been willing to really disentangle politicians from the reality. They say what they have to do is really to create things for decision making prior to any contact with reality. And he says the physical sciences, he's talking here about physical science in the First World War, and they say they have to be successful in making a change in strategic position. And so they say because of their abstract knowledge, which is just numbers and graphs and so on, they have made people, politicians and businessmen, to rely on that kind of abstract knowledge. So politicians today, they make decisions about what weapons to use and so on. They don't have any specific experience about it. They cannot tell anything about concrete chemicals and so on, but they are just to make decisions based on certain numbers. They cannot evaluate themselves. So scientific models, statistics, etc., come to play a role as dominant pseudo-environments, and these are shaped mostly by statistics, and especially by what he calls pure science. If you have a science that just relies on mathematics and not on experience, you're very successful in creating a barrier between reality and the person who has to make a decision. So that is the whole concept to why do you use a very abstract science? Because it is not modeled after reality, but it gives you a whole place to play within this pseudo-environment, which is completely abstract from reality. And most interesting, what he says is that social sciences, especially economists, have not been so successful until that day to create such abstract pictures of reality. So what he calls for is that scientists must come in front of the action, that they have to form the basic pictures politicians and normal men of affairs are to try to make their decisions. He's talking, and at one point he said, well, the economists have already been successful, not so much in creating abstract pseudo-environments, that wasn't possible in his days, but creating what he calls working images. So here talking about the simplified diagrams about economics, not so different in principle and in veracity from the parallelogram with legs and heads in a child's drawing of a complicated cow. And so here we are, as economics, we are successful making abstractions, and we have also in 1926 been successful in making people to believe that this is a world, a set of, it's a sort of world the model assumed and could be used as kind of pseudo environment I've been talking before. But here it is not already an education process, but it's just using some metaphors in this sense. If you then go on to Hayek, this is now after the Second World War, he comes much more specific in talking about how you can make a whole science, especially economics, as part of shaping, or as a basic factor of shaping what he now calls a climate of opinion. Here, this is a quotation from Rechtgesetzgebung und Freiheit. It's a quotation aus Rechtgesetzgebung und Freiheit, in dem, where he says that die Macht abstrakter Ideen beruht in hohem Maße auf eben der Tatsache, dass sie nicht bewusst als Theorien aufgefasst, sondern von den meisten Menschen als unmittelbar einleuchtende Wahrheiten angesehen werden, die als stillschweigend angenommene Voraussetzungen fungieren. So here he now explicitly takes economics in the context of creating pseudo-environments, stereotypes, and he says the advantage is that it has all the scientific atmosphere, the whole scientific favor behind it. And now he tries to identify three sort of thinkers, and where he says, well, he just wants to have one favorite thinker left, especially in the economics department. The original thinker is someone who knows about the basic assumptions about his Weltanschauung, who's really capable of de-brainwashing, as to say, of really knowing the stereotypes and pseudo-environments of his time. This is one, the scholar or experts in a particular field of thought is someone who really has experience, who's directly working in some fields of the economy, for example, and who does have a working knowledge prior to any filters that science can come to establish. And the third is the intellectual, and before I go on, you can now assume what he wants. He wants to kick out the first two out of the departments. And he's just focusing on what he calls the intellectual. The role of intellectuals, you can read it in Intellectuals in Socialism, people who judge all issues not by their specific merits, but in the characteristic manners of intellectuals, solely in the light of certain fashionable general ideas. And what they have to have is an absence of direct responsibility for practical affairs and the consequent absence of first-hand knowledge. To put it bluntly, you're not allowed to have any first-hand knowledge of reality and shouldn't be entangled in every sort of everyday life. You should filter your ideas through the conviction of a class. It's a quite interesting thing here. And they should function as the gatekeepers of ideas. So they are the one who filters for politicians, for journalists, for television makers, and so on, for educators at schools. They filter what you should come to know of reality as such. And they believed, or Hayek believed, if you could first take the educators, that is the professors, then you would take over all the intellectuals that are trained at schools and university, and then you would slowly, it's a process takes about 30 or 40 years, he says, then you'd slowly come to take over the whole public opinion of a society. So this was about, this whole concept was ready about the 1950s, and it was directly effective in what then came to know as the neoliberal economic think tanks. The Institute of Economic Affairs, it's just going over this quickly, is one of the most influential neoliberal think tanks we have. It was established in the 1950s. It was in Great Britain, and it was Margaret Thatcher who said it was this institute who made possible her victory because of changing ideas before. Hayek was one of the founding members. He was going together with very influential people from the economic scene, businessmen especially. One of them was the first who had all these chicken farms making the mass production of chicken meat, was one of the most important figures from that side. So you have here the publication of one of their directors, John Blundell, and he really calls about waging the war of ideas, and he's talking explicitly about the role economic and economic education should play in these war of ideas. The trick of the war of ideas is to persuade fellow men that not only the free market allocation of goods and services is economically efficient and wealth enhancing, but also, and much more importantly, that market allocation is morally superior to other methods of exchange. And here it's just talking about persuasion in the sense you've seen it by Walter Lippmann before. So it's not an explicit discussion with people, but it's a strategy of persuasion. It's talking about a change in idea, reaching first, as I said, the intellectuals, the teachers and writers, and by their influence, the politicians will follow. So it's called, John Blundell calls it, it's an indirect war. What you want is to take over the political affairs of the day. You want to influence political decisions, but you never grapple with politicians themselves. It's never been the strategy of neoliberal think tanks, but it's called, it's like an artillery fight. It's firing ideas on intellectuals, and these intellectuals, by taking over a neoliberal mindset about free market allocation, will then come to influence political decisions of the day. So if you use that concept of Walter Lippmann again, it is by education and persuasion to put market ideas, to establish them in this kind of pseudo environments. And what is most important, to distract people from reality. Yeah, so no propaganda can ever work. If you have experts of fields of knowledge, if you have, for example, students that really know some part of reality and could talk about it, you can forget about influencing public opinion in this way. And what you really have to avoid is that intellectuals grow capable of questioning their own mindsets and their own concepts. And if you're really successful to keep them from both sides, from reflection on the one side and about an entanglement with reality, a reflective entanglement, then public opinion will work. So here's my, so the question is, can economic education, can it play, in the way it is today, can it play a dominant role in society without changing, as we would have expected if you just stick to a Kuhnian perspective? And my answer is, well, it's pretty much well suited for doing a job. If it is an efficient artillery, economic education to teach neither facts about economic reality, nor any method to observe or interpret that reality, to establish a surrogate for reality. That means models that do not have any contact whatsoever to economic reality, create working images without any relation to everyday experience. And this is really about the use of abstract mathematical models in the context of influencing public creation, give no possible guidance for either self-reflection or reflection on market ideas itself, and make some implicit assumption prior to any conscious reflection about the market being economically efficient, wealth enhancing, and morally superior to other methods of exchange. So this is just a broad setting a scene where we might explain why something that is the state of economic education is in today may be useful for some concepts, especially in the neoliberal context. It doesn't explain, and that's pretty important for any future research, it doesn't explain how this really came to work. I mean, this could be just a coincidence. So some talk about about propaganda, and the others are molding scientific education just by chance. It happens to be the same. So here you would really have to now to show the power structures of neoliberal think tanks, the influence they had on textbooks, on authors, on economic education, the role of the neoliberals in informing the economization of education itself. But this is not what I want to do, but I just want to only point out about alternatives. So the question what we can do if we take this pretty serious as an option that economic education has come to fall prey to some propaganda project. And I'm just doing this here in a very concrete way. We have done some kind of research on this prior to establishing Cusanus University. And we are thinking about the kind of changes you have to do to economic education in order to give a real alternative. It's about the nature of the curriculum. We have been talking about this a lot at this conference. It's about changing the style of teaching and probably most important, changing the structure of power and decision making. So here just a couple of things, a couple of phrases I just throw at you, just to make it short. What we try to do is basically, in the words of Hayek, really to have real-world experts on the one side and original thinkers on the other side in order to get to a minimum of what Hayek called intellectuals. And here you really have to treat real-world affairs and treating with them from different perspectives. You have, going back to Kuhn, to include the history of economics, the history of economic teaching, which I think is now almost missing at any university here in Germany at least. You also have to teach this history of the economy. Teach about the fundamental roles of education in society and the problems you have when it comes part of projects influencing public opinion. You have to include debates about premises in order to make pseudo environments at least visible or partly visible, if that is possible. You have to talk about biographies, and you have to talk about personalities, and not to think that choices for one paradigm or the others is just part of non-conscious development within society. Changes in the style of teaching, I think that's very important. If you see that now you have a massive influence of what we call like an anonymous education. We are not really involved as a personality, but you just have to perform a role. You just sit there with about 5,000 or 1,000 people in the room. You have to do the same, exactly the same questions during exam, and there's always a certain right and a certain wrong. This doesn't work, so you really have to go back to smaller classes. You have to encourage self-reflection and self-development. You have to foster own research activities that really go out there and to answer questions that are out there in society. So this is part of what we call a change in the style of teaching. And then what is, I think, one of the most important, of the most neglected issues of this conference that we have to come to use to talk about structures of power and of decision making. We have just have here the students discussing how difficult it is to make a change even to one class or to one lecture, and this is that the whole structure of the universities have come under an influence of a neoliberal project itself, which you can, for example, see in the Bologna process. What we have done is that we say, well, we establish a democratic self-governing universities. It's kind of pity that this has to happen in the private sector. It would have been better if that would have been possible within the state universities, but we didn't see any real room for this anymore, in which students involved in decision-making processes, so they come to live education as a real-world experience and not kind of an abstract laboratory for influencing their minds. And third, to make explicit power and decision-making structures of the university and even about state regulation of universities. And these, both in private and public universities, to my opinion, include issues of funding and finance. So how is it possible, and where are the influences on textbooks, on the use of textbook, on the selling of textbooks? How is it, what are the power structures that make people, like a statement one colleague just gave, that there is not even for professors any kind of substantial room for making changes within universities. Thank you.